Well, the administration has continued to increase pressure on Moscow. As an example, the president levied additional sanctions late last year on their oil company, on Rosneft. The administration continues to sell weaponry to Ukraine. We don't sell weapons to Russia, and we don't sanction Ukraine. The president values the fact that he is the only global leader that has any chance in the world of bringing these two sides together to a negotiating table. We're the only country or only entity on the planet that's been able to achieve having Russian negotiators and Ukrainian negotiators sit at a table and talk to one another. And for a war as horrible as this, so we don't want to walk away from the, we know that at the end, that war in Ukraine does not have a military solution. That war will be settled through a negotiation. And right now, we are the only country in the world that can be a catalyst for negotiation. If we forfeit that role, no one else can do it. That said, do I believe the president's patience is infinite? I do not. But I'm not going to forecast for you when that runs out or at what point he decides not to do it any longer. I can tell you, and I think you've heard him express, a deep frustration that this has not come to an end because he sees it as a completely stupid and senseless war in which... All right? Let's go home. No, it's always been legal to sell to the private sector in Cuba. Okay, these would not be sales to the government. These would not be sales to the military-owned Gaesa, the company. These would be sales to a very small private sector that exists in Cuba, and that's always been legal. I mean, there are people that have a license to do that now. This would just expand to the numbers that could do it. Again, it would go to the private sector. The private sector in Cuba is quite small. It exists, but it's small. And it certainly, in and of itself, does not have the capacity to deal with the scale and scope of the challenges they're facing. Now, if you go back to President Trump's 2017 or 2018 executive orders on a new policy in Cuba, that policy was entirely designed in many ways to put the private sector and individual private Cubans, not affiliated with the government, not affiliated with the military, in a privileged position. The reason why those industries have not flourished in Cuba is because the regime has not allowed them to flourish. So now that they're in a crisis, there's an opportunity for them to import fuel in small quantities, granted, through a private sector. If we catch the private sector there playing games and diverting it to the regime or to the military company, if we find that they're moving that stuff around in ways that violate the spirit and the scope of these permissions, those licenses will be canceled. Not solve Cuba's very dramatic problems that have been caused by 60 some odd years of mismanagement.
Cutting edge NVIDIA chips or other AI chips and things.
Yeah, so I think we've reached a point at least of sort of strategic stability in the relationship. I think both countries concluded that having an all-out global trade war between the United States and China would be deeply damaging to both sides and to the world. There remain issues of disagreement. There remain issues that we know in the long term are going to have to be confronted and could be irritants in our relationship. We've not been bashful in saying that we don't think we don't think it's sustainable to live in a world where we depend on some country for 90% of anything, whether it's supply chains or critical minerals or the like, pharmaceuticals and the like. And we have every intention of doing everything we can to ensure that our critical supply chains are diversified. And that will continue to be a point of contention, I imagine. But that's something that's critical to our national security and that we've been working on and will continue to work on. I also think that from a responsibility standpoint, the two largest economies in the world who both possess nuclear arsenals have to be able to talk, have to be able to communicate, and have to be able to interact. It would be reckless and irresponsible for the United States and China not to have meetings, not to have conversations, and not to have opportunities for our leaders to interact with one another. I just think I don't know anybody who thinks that's a good idea. It would be foolish and frankly dangerous for us not to have a relationship with them, even as our areas of conflict and disagreement remain. Well, we think ultimately in the 21st century, for there to be a true arms control agreement, it has to involve China. Their stockpiles have increased dramatically. Their position that they would argue is that they're still way behind the United States and Russia. We think that's irrelevant. They certainly have the capacity to catch up and are well on their way to doing so. So we believe, the President strongly believes, that for any sort of agreement, on nuclear agreement in the 21st century to be legitimate, it has to involve these three countries, the United States, Russia, and China. And we're going to continue to explore their willingness to do so. They have publicly said they're not willing to do it. I'm sure you've heard them say that. I'm sure they've reiterated, and I know they restated that again very recently. But we'll continue to press on it because we think it would be good for the world if we could reach such an agreement. The president would be in favor of that if we could do it, but it has to be all three countries.